The blood on her torn dress caught Xavier Zimmerman's attention before he even heard her cry for help. Tangled deep in a massive thicket of mesquite and prickly pear cactus, just off the dusty trail outside El Paso, Texas, in the summer of 1878. Xavier had been riding his bay mare through the scorching afternoon heat, heading back to town after checking on his small herd of cattle grazing in the sparse grasslands. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he had been thinking about nothing more than a cold beer at the saloon when he heard what sounded like a wounded animal. His hand instinctively went to the rifle on his saddle, but then he heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, weak and desperate. He dismounted quickly, tying his horse to a scraggly juniper tree, and approached the thorny mass cautiously. The mesquite branches were thick and twisted, their needle-sharp thorns catching on his leather vest as he pushed closer. That's when he saw her, a young woman with dark hair matted against her face, her clothes torn in a dozen places, blood seeping from scratches covering her arms and legs. "Hold still," Xavier called out, his voice steady despite the urgency pumping through his veins. "I'm coming to get you out." The woman's eyes found his, wide and filled with pain and fear. She looked to be in her early 20s, perhaps younger, though it was hard to tell through the dirt and blood streaking her face. Her dress, which might have once been a pale yellow, was now stained brown with dust and spotted with crimson. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I cannot move. Everything hurts." Xavier assessed the situation quickly. She was wedged deep into the thicket, at least 6 feet from the edge where he stood. The thorns had caught her dress, her hair, and her skin in what looked like hundreds of places. Every movement she made only seemed to drive them deeper. "What's your name?" he asked, pulling his thick leather gloves from his belt and sliding them on. He needed to keep her talking, keep her focused on something other than the pain. "Marlowe," she managed. "Marlowe Fairchild." "All right, Marlowe, I'm Xavier. I'm going to get you out, but you need to stay as still as possible." "Can you do that?" She nodded slightly, wincing as even that small movement pulled at the thorns embedded in her scalp. Xavier began the painstaking work of pushing through the mesquite. Each branch he moved seemed to spring back with vicious intent, and even through his gloves and thick shirt, he could feel the thorns finding their way to his skin. He ignored the pain, focusing instead on the woman in front of him, on reaching her, on freeing her from this natural prison. "How did you end up in here?" he asked, partly to distract her and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. People didn't just accidentally fall into mesquite thickets this dense. "My horse," Marlowe said, her breathing shallow. "There was a rattlesnake. She reared up and I fell. I rolled down the embankment and into this. I tried to get out, but I just made it worse." Xavier could see the truth of her words in the way the thorns angled into her skin, all pointing in the same direction, as if she had indeed tried to pull herself through and only succeeded in tangling herself more completely. He was close enough now to touch her shoulder. Up close, he could see that beneath the blood and dirt, she had delicate features and green eyes that reminded him of the rare patches of grass that managed to survive the Texas summer. There was intelligence in those eyes and strength too, despite her current predicament. "This is going to hurt," he warned, beginning to carefully extract the thorns from her right arm. "But I'll be as gentle as I can." Marlowe bit her lip and nodded. Xavier worked methodically, starting with the thorns in her arms, carefully pulling each one out before moving to the next. Some were embedded deep, and he could see her flinch with each extraction, though she made no sound. He found himself admiring her fortitude. "Where are you from?" he asked, trying to keep her mind occupied. "St. Louis," she replied, her voice tight with suppressed pain. I came west with my father. He is a banker. He was offered a position in El Paso. He died 3 weeks ago, cholera. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Xavier paused in his work, meeting her eyes. I'm sorry. She nodded, tears mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. I was riding to clear my head. I should not have gone so far from town alone. I know it was foolish. Grief makes us do things we might not otherwise do, Xavier said quietly, returning to his work. He had moved on to her left arm now, and then began the delicate task of freeing her hair from the mesquite branches. Each strand seemed to be caught in multiple places, and he had to use his knife to cut some of it free. You are very kind, Marlowe said, watching his face as he concentrated on freeing her without causing more pain than necessary. Just doing what anyone would do, Xavier replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. The wilderness was harsh, and kindness was not always easy to come by in the untamed lands of West Texas. It took nearly an hour to free her completely. By the time Xavier finally pulled her clear of the thicket, they were both exhausted and bleeding. He carried her away from the mesquite and set her down gently in the shade of his horse. She collapsed against him, her strength finally giving out. You pulled me from the pain, she whispered against his chest, her voice filled with such raw gratitude that it made his heart clench. Xavier held her for a moment, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his own. Then he gently pulled back, reaching for his canteen. Drink this, he said, slowly. Marlowe took the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water seemed to revive her somewhat, bringing color back to her pale cheeks. Xavier used some of the water to clean the worst of her wounds, tearing strips from his spare shirt to bandage the deeper cuts. Can you ride? He asked when he had done what he could. Marlowe looked at his horse and then back at him. I think so. I am sorry to be such a burden. You're not a burden, Xavier said firmly. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to buckle. I'm taking you to the doctor in town. Your wounds need proper treatment. He mounted first, then reached down and pulled her up behind him. Marlowe wrapped her arms around his waist, and Xavier tried to ignore the way his body responded to her closeness. She was injured and vulnerable, he reminded himself. The last thing she needed was some cowboy reading more into the situation than was there. The ride back to El Paso took longer than usual because Xavier kept his horse to a slow walk, not wanting to jostle Marlowe any more than necessary. She rested her head against his back, and he could feel her breathing gradually steadying. Tell me about yourself, Marlowe said after a while, her voice stronger now. You know about my tragedy. It seems only fair I should know something of yours. Xavier found himself surprised by the request and more surprised still by his desire to answer honestly. Not much to tell. I've been in El Paso for about 5 years. Got a small ranch outside town, run some cattle. It's not much, but it's mine. No family, not anymore. My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I was 16. Been on my own since then. I am sorry, Marlowe said softly. It seems we have both known loss. They rode in companionable silence for a while after that. Xavier found himself acutely aware of Marlowe's presence behind him, the way her hands rested at his waist, the warmth of her, even through his shirt. He told himself it was just the circumstances, the natural human response to helping someone in need, but part of him knew it was more than that. El Paso came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The town was small but growing, with new buildings going up every month as more people pushed west seeking opportunities. Xavier guided his horse down the main street, aware of the curious stares they were attracting. A man and a woman, both bloodied and torn, riding together through town was bound to cause talk. Dr. Samuel Harris had his practice in a small building near the edge of town. Xavier dismounted and helped Marlowe down, supporting her as they made their way to the door. The doctor, a gray-haired man in his 50s, took one look at them and ushered them inside immediately. "What happened?" Dr. Harris asked, already beginning to examine Marlowe's wounds. "Mesquite thicket," Xavier explained. "She got thrown from her horse." The doctor nodded, his experienced hands gentle as he cleaned and treated Marlowe's injuries. Xavier stood off to the side, suddenly feeling out of place. His part in this was done. He had rescued her and brought her to safety. There was no reason for him to stay, and yet he found himself reluctant to leave. "You should let me look at you too," Dr. Harris said, glancing at Xavier. "You're bleeding in half a dozen places." Xavier looked down at himself and realized the doctor was right. His shirt was torn and spotted with blood, his arms covered in scratches. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Sit," the doctor ordered in a tone that brooked no argument. Xavier sat. Marlowe watched from the examination table as the doctor treated Xavier's wounds. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged in the shared experience of pain and rescue. "You're lucky this young man found you when he did," Dr. Harris told Marlowe as he wrapped a bandage around her forearm. "Another few hours in this heat without water and things could have been much worse." "I know," Marlowe said quietly, her eyes still on Xavier. "I am very aware of my good fortune." When the doctor finished, he gave Marlowe strict instructions about keeping her wounds clean and watching for signs of infection. Xavier paid the doctor despite Marlowe's protests, waving away her promises to repay him. "Where are you staying?" Xavier asked as they stepped back out into the evening air. "The boarding house on 3rd Street, Marlowe said. "Mrs. Patterson's place." Xavier knew it, a respectable establishment run by a widow who took in boarders to make ends meet. He offered Marlowe his arm, and they walked slowly through the dusty streets. The evening air was cooler now, bringing some relief from the oppressive heat of the day. "Thank you," Marlowe said as they walked. "I do not know how I can ever repay you for what you did today." "You don't need to repay me," Xavier replied. "I'm just glad I came along when I did." They reached the boarding house and Xavier helped Marlowe up the steps to the porch. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with kind eyes, came bustling out when she saw them, her face filled with concern. "Marlowe, dear, what happened?" she exclaimed, taking in the bandages and torn dress. "An accident with my horse," Marlowe explained. "Mr. Zimmerman here rescued me. Mrs. Patterson, may I introduce Xavier Zimmerman? Xavier, this is my landlady, Mrs. Alina Patterson." "Pleased to meet you, madam," Xavier said, tipping his hat. Mrs. Patterson looked between them with sharp, assessing eyes. "Well, Mr. Zimmerman, it seems we owe you a debt of gratitude. Won't you come in for supper? It's the least we can do." Xavier started to decline, but Marlowe's hopeful expression stopped him. "I would be honored," he heard himself say instead. That was how Xavier found himself sitting at Mrs. Patterson's dinner table an hour later, cleaned up as best he could manage and sharing a meal with Marlowe and the 3 other boarders who lived at the house. There was Mr. Grayson, an elderly gentleman who ran the general store, Miss Catherine Wells, a schoolteacher from Boston, and young Timothy Cooper, a clerk at the bank where Marlowe's father had worked. The conversation flowed easily, despite the unusual circumstances. Marlowe had changed into a clean dress, and though she moved stiffly from her injuries, she seemed in better spirits. Xavier found himself telling stories about his ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in the harsh Texas climate, about the time he had helped track down a mountain lion that had been preying on his herd. In turn, he learned more about Marlowe. She had been educated at a fine school in St. Louis, could speak French and play the piano, and had a sharp mind for business that had surprised the men at her father's bank. Her father had been teaching her the banking trade, an unusual thing for a woman, but he had believed she had the intelligence and temperament for it. "What will you do now?" Xavier asked during a lull in the conversation. "Will you stay in El Paso?" Marlowe's expression grew thoughtful. "I do not know. My father's affairs are not yet settled. The bank has offered me a small position, helping with correspondence and record-keeping. It is not what my father intended for me, but it is something. I have enough money to sustain me for a few months while I decide." Xavier nodded, understanding the unspoken challenge in her words. A single woman alone in a frontier town had limited options. She could marry, she could work in one of the few positions deemed acceptable for women, or she could leave. None of the choices were particularly appealing. After dinner, Xavier prepared to take his leave. Marlowe walked him to the door, moving more easily now that she had eaten and rested. "Thank you again," she said, "for everything. For saving my life, for the doctor, for staying for dinner. You have been nothing but kind." "It was my pleasure," Xavier said, and meant it. "Will you be all right?" "I will heal," Marlowe assured him. "Dr. Harris said I was lucky that none of the wounds were too deep. I will be sore for a while, but I will be fine." Xavier hesitated, then said, "If you need anything at all, you can find me. Ask anyone in town where the Zimmerman ranch is. It's not far." Marlowe smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face despite the bruises and bandages. "I will remember that. Perhaps when I am healed I could come visit. I would like to see this ranch of yours." "I would like that," Xavier said, his heart beating faster at the prospect. He rode home through the darkness, his mind full of Marlowe. The way she had endured the pain without complaint, the intelligence in her eyes, the strength he sensed in her despite her current vulnerability. He told himself he was being foolish, that one afternoon did not mean anything, but he could not shake the feeling that something significant had happened today, something beyond a simple rescue. The next few days passed slowly for Xavier. He went about his usual work, tending to his cattle, repairing fences, making his weekly trip into town for supplies, but his thoughts kept returning to Marlowe. He wondered how she was healing, whether her wounds were mending properly, whether she thought of him at all. It was nearly a week before he saw her again. He had gone into town to pick up supplies from the general store when he spotted her walking down the main street. She moved with only a slight stiffness now, her wounds apparently healing well. She wore a simple blue dress and a bonnet to protect her face from the sun, and Xavier thought she looked even more beautiful than he remembered. Their eyes met across the street, and Marlowe's face broke into a smile. She crossed over to him, navigating around a wagon making deliveries. "Xavier," she said, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice. "I was hoping I might see you. How are you?" he asked. "Your injuries?" "Much better," she assured him. "Dr. Harris says I am healing remarkably well. The scars will fade in time." She paused, then added, "I have been thinking about your invitation to visit the ranch. Is the offer still open?" "Of course," Xavier said immediately. "Whenever you would like." "How about tomorrow?" Marlowe suggested, "if the timing suits you." "I have the day off from the bank, and I find myself eager to escape town for a while. Too many people asking questions about what happened." Xavier understood. Small towns thrived on gossip, and Marlowe's accident and his role in rescuing her had undoubtedly been the subject of much speculation. "Tomorrow would be fine. I could come get you in the morning." "I will be ready," Marlowe promised. Xavier arrived at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house the next morning driving his wagon rather than riding his horse. He had cleaned up the wagon bed and put fresh hay down, wanting to make the ride as comfortable as possible for Marlowe. He had also taken extra care with his own appearance, wearing his best shirt and actually combing his hair, much to his own amusement. When had he started caring so much about how he looked? Marlowe came out wearing a practical riding dress and carrying a basket. "Mrs. Patterson insisted I bring lunch," she explained. "She has been fussing over me constantly since the accident. I think she feels guilty for not warning me more strongly about riding out alone." The ride to Xavier's ranch took about 40 minutes, following a rough trail that wound through the scrubland. Xavier pointed out landmarks along the way, explaining which sections of land belonged to which ranchers, where the best water sources were, which areas to avoid because of snakes or other dangers. Marlowe listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that showed she was genuinely interested. Xavier found himself relaxing, talking more freely than he usually did. There was something about her presence that made conversation easy, natural. The Zimmerman ranch was modest by any standard. Xavier owned about 500 acres, much of it rocky and suitable only for grazing. His house was small, just 3 rooms that he had built himself over the course of his first year in Texas. There was a barn that housed his 3 horses and provided storage for feed and equipment, a small chicken coop, and various corrals and pens for the cattle. "It is not much," Xavier said as they approached, suddenly seeing his home through Marlowe's eyes and finding it wanting. She had come from St. Louis, from a life of relative comfort and refinement. What must she think of his rough homestead? But Marlowe's expression held no judgment, only interest. "It is yours," she said simply. "That makes it worth more than the finest house that belongs to someone else." Xavier helped her down from the wagon, and they spent the morning walking around the property. He showed her the cattle, explaining the challenges of ranching in such an arid climate. He introduced her to his horses, including the bay mare that had carried them both back to town. Marlowe surprised him by producing a carrot from her basket and feeding it to the horse, stroking its nose gently. "I grew up around horses," she explained. "My grandfather had a small farm outside St. Louis. I spent my summers there as a child. I miss it sometimes, that connection to the land and animals." They ate the lunch misses. Patterson had prepared sitting on Xavier's small porch, watching the afternoon heat shimmer across the landscape. The food was simple but good: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apple pie. "Tell me about your family," Marlowe said as they ate. "You said your parents died when you were young. Were there no other relatives?" Xavier shook his head. "None that wanted the responsibility of a teenage boy. I had an uncle back east, but he made it clear he had no interest in taking me in. So I worked odd jobs, saved what I could, and eventually made my way out here. Texas seemed like a place where a man could start fresh, build something of his own." "And have you?" Marlowe asked. "Built what you wanted?" Xavier considered the question. "I have a home, land, a small herd. It is more than I had 10 years ago, but sometimes—" He trailed off, not sure how to articulate the loneliness that occasionally overwhelmed him, the sense that something was missing from his life despite everything he had accomplished. "Sometimes it is not enough just to survive," Marlowe finished for him. "Sometimes we need more. Connection, purpose, love." Their eyes met, and Xavier felt that pull again, that sense of recognition he had felt the first time he saw her. "Yes," he said quietly, "exactly that." The afternoon passed quickly. Marlowe helped Xavier with some of his chores, insisting despite his protests that she was perfectly capable of collecting eggs from the chicken coop and helping him move some supplies into the barn. They worked well together, Xavier noticed, falling into an easy rhythm that felt natural and right. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Xavier reluctantly prepared to take Marlowe back to town. They drove slowly, neither seeming eager to end the day. The conversation had moved to lighter topics now, sharing stories and laughing together. Xavier could not remember the last time he had laughed so much. "Thank you for today," Marlowe said as they neared El Paso. "I had a wonderful time. Your ranch is lovely and the company was even better." "You are welcome anytime," Xavier said, and then, gathering his courage, added, "I enjoyed having you there. The place felt more like a home with you in it." Marlowe turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Xavier," she said softly, "I hope you will not think me forward, but I feel I must be honest with you. Since the day you rescued me, I have thought of little else but you. I know we have only just met, and perhaps it is foolish, but I feel a connection to you that I cannot explain." Xavier's heart soared. "I feel it too," he admitted. "I was afraid it was just me, that I was reading too much into things." "You are not," Marlowe assured him. She reached out and took his hand, and even through their gloves Xavier could feel the warmth of her touch. "I would very much like to spend more time with you if you are willing." "I am more than willing," Xavier said. "I want to court you properly, Marlowe. I want to get to know everything about you." Over the following weeks, Xavier and Marlowe fell into a pattern. He would come into town several times a week, and they would walk together, sometimes just around El Paso, sometimes riding out to explore the surrounding countryside. On Sundays, they attended church together, sitting side by side in the small wooden chapel while the congregation speculated about their relationship. Xavier learned that Marlowe had a quick wit and a sharp tongue when provoked. He discovered that she loved to read, that she had opinions on everything from politics to ranching that she was not afraid to share, and that she had a generous heart that led her to help anyone in need. She had already made herself invaluable at the bank, streamlining their record-keeping system and catching several errors that had gone unnoticed for months. Marlowe learned that Xavier was quieter than he seemed, that he thought carefully before speaking, and that his word, once given, was absolute. She saw the way he treated everyone with respect, from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest day laborer. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that often caught her by surprise, and that his hands, rough from work, could be incredibly gentle. They talked about everything. Their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. Xavier told Marlowe about his struggles starting the ranch, about the first cattle he had bought and the first fence he had built. Marlowe told Xavier about her education, about her father's progressive ideas regarding women's capabilities, and about the strange mix of grief and freedom she felt now that she was truly on her own. 2 months after Xavier had pulled Marlowe from the thorny bush, he invited her to dinner at the ranch. He spent the entire day preparing, cleaning the house from top to bottom, attempting to cook something more elaborate than his usual simple fare. The result was slightly burned but edible, and Marlowe declared it the best meal she had ever had, though Xavier suspected she was being generous. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the day's heat. Xavier had given Marlowe his jacket, and she sat close to him, their shoulders touching. "Marlowe," Xavier said, his voice nervous, "these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. I know we have not known each other long, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore." Marlowe turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "I feel the same way," she whispered. Xavier took her hands in his. "I do not have much to offer. This ranch is small and the work is hard, but I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to make you happy. I will respect you and value you and love you with everything I have." He took a deep breath. "Marlowe Fairchild, will you marry me? Tears spilled down Marlowe's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I do not need grand promises or wealth. I just need you, Xavier. You pulled me from the pain, both literally and figuratively. You showed me that there was still goodness in the world, still reasons to hope. Of course I will marry you." Xavier pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "When?" Xavier asked. "When can we marry?" "As soon as possible," Marlowe replied. "Unless you want a long engagement." "Not particularly," Xavier admitted. "I have waited my whole life to find you. I do not want to wait any longer than necessary." They decided on a month, enough time to make the necessary arrangements, but not so long that the wait would be unbearable. Marlowe continued to live at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, though she spent most of her free time at the ranch, helping Xavier prepare. They added a room to the small house, Xavier working late into the evening to finish it before the wedding. Marlowe made curtains and bought furniture for their home, using money from her father's estate. The wedding took place on a beautiful October morning, the heat of summer finally broken by cooler autumn temperatures. Nearly the entire town of El Paso turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church on the edge of town. Marlowe wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and Xavier wore his best suit, purchased new for the occasion. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony, his voice booming in the small space. When it came time for the vows, Xavier and Marlowe spoke them clearly, their eyes locked on each other, oblivious to the crowd watching. "I, Xavier, take you, Marlowe, to be my wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as we both shall live. I, Marlowe, take you, Xavier, to be my wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as we both shall live." When Reverend Thomas pronounced them man and wife, and told Xavier he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was met with applause and cheers from the congregation. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, married at last. Mrs. Patterson had organized a celebration at her boarding house, and the party lasted well into the afternoon. There was food and music, dancing and laughter. Xavier had never been much for dancing, but with Marlowe in his arms, he found himself not caring about his clumsy feet or lack of grace. She laughed when he stepped on her toes, and he twirled her around the makeshift dance floor, both of them grinning like fools. As the sun began to set, Xavier and Marlowe finally made their escape, driving back to the ranch that was now their home. The house looked warm and welcoming in the evening light, smoke rising from the chimney where Xavier had left a fire burning that morning. Xavier carried Marlowe over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room. The laughter faded as they looked at each other, suddenly aware that they were truly alone, truly married, and that this was the beginning of their life together. "Are you nervous?" Xavier asked softly. "A little," Marlowe admitted, "but mostly I am happy, so very happy." Xavier cupped her face in his hands and kissed her tenderly. "I love you, Marlowe Zimmerman." "I love you too," Marlowe replied. And then there were no more words, just the two of them learning each other, discovering the intimacy of marriage, creating a bond that would last the rest of their lives. The months that followed were full of joy and hard work. Marlowe threw herself into life on the ranch with an enthusiasm that both surprised and delighted Xavier. She learned to help with the cattle, to mend fences, to handle a rifle well enough to protect the chickens from foxes and coyotes. She kept the house spotlessly clean despite the dust that blew in constantly, planted a small garden that actually managed to produce vegetables despite the harsh climate, and even learned to cook reasonably well. Xavier, in turn, made sure that their home was a place of comfort and peace. He added more rooms as they needed them, built Marlowe a bookshelf for the growing collection of books she acquired, and made sure she had time to pursue her own interests. She continued to do some work for the bank, helping with their accounts a few days a month, and Xavier supported this, understanding that she needed intellectual stimulation beyond what ranch life alone could provide. Their first winter together was cold, with several snowstorms that left them snowed in for days at a time. But Xavier found he did not mind being trapped indoors with Marlowe. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Marlowe reading aloud from one of her books while Xavier worked on repairing tack or whittling. Sometimes they just talked, sharing their thoughts and dreams, planning for the future. "I want children," Marlowe said one evening, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder. "Several of them, running around the ranch, filling this house with noise and laughter." Xavier smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I want that too. I want to give you everything, Marlowe. I want to build a life here that our children will be proud of." "They will be," Marlowe assured him, "because they will have you as a father. You will teach them to be strong and kind and honorable just like you are." Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves were born, Marlowe's garden burst into bloom, and in early April, Marlowe confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was with child. Xavier's joy was overwhelming. He picked Marlowe up and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. That evening they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Xavier's hand resting on Marlowe's still flat stomach, both of them marveling at the miracle growing within her. "Boy or girl?" Xavier asked. "I do not know," Marlowe replied, "but healthy, that is all I ask for." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Marlowe continued to work around the ranch well into her 6th month, only slowing down when Xavier finally put his foot down and insisted she rest more. Dr. Harris came out to the ranch monthly to check on her, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy and thriving. In late October of 1879, just over a year after their wedding, Marlowe went into labor. Xavier rode hard into town to fetch Dr. Harris, then paced the house nervously while the doctor and Mrs. Patterson, who had come to help, tended to Marlowe in the bedroom. The labor was long and difficult. Xavier could hear Marlowe's cries of pain through the door, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand and comfort her, but Mrs. Patterson had firmly told him that the birthing room was no place for a man. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was actually about 12 hours, Xavier heard a new sound. A baby's cry, strong and healthy. He stopped pacing, his heart pounding, waiting for news. The bedroom door opened and Dr. Harris emerged, looking tired but smiling. "Congratulations, Xavier, you have a son, a healthy, strong son." Xavier could barely speak. "And Marlowe, she is exhausted but well. Come meet your boy." Xavier entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Marlowe lay in the bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant. In her arms she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. Xavier approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. "Xavier," Marlowe said softly, tears streaming down her face, "meet our son." Xavier looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. His son, his and Marlowe's son. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, though closed now, would probably be Xavier's gray-blue. He was perfect, absolutely perfect. "Can I hold him?" Xavier asked hesitantly. Marlowe carefully transferred the baby into Xavier's arms. Xavier held his son, feeling the light weight of him, the warmth, the reality of this new life they had created. Tears ran down his face unchecked. "What should we name him?" Marlowe asked. They had discussed names but had not made a final decision. Xavier looked down at his son and knew. "Matthew," he said. "Matthew Thomas Zimmerman, after the Reverend who married us." "Matthew," Marlowe repeated, smiling. "It is perfect." The first months of Matthew's life were exhausting and wonderful. Xavier and Marlowe took turns walking the floor with him when he cried at night, marveling at every new expression, every tiny change. Xavier found himself working faster to complete his daily chores so he could spend more time with his family. He had never imagined he could love anyone as much as he loved Marlowe, but Matthew had opened up new depths in his heart. Marlowe proved to be a natural mother. She nursed Matthew and cared for him with patience and love, but she also made sure to maintain her own identity. Once Matthew was a few months old and sleeping more reliably through the night, she started taking on more work for the bank again, sometimes bringing Matthew with her into town. The ranch prospered. Xavier had expanded his herd, and the cattle were thriving. He had also diversified, adding sheep and more chickens, creating multiple income streams that provided stability. With Marlowe's help managing the finances, they were not only surviving but actually saving money, building toward a more secure future. When Matthew was 2 years old, Marlowe became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1882, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Alice, after Marlowe's mother who had died when Marlowe was young. Margaret had Marlowe's green eyes and her quick temper. Even as an infant, she made her opinions known loudly and clearly. Xavier doted on her, this tiny girl who had him wrapped around her finger from the moment he first held her. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Xavier and Marlowe's love for each other only deepened with time. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and difficult years, but they faced it all together, their partnership strong and unshakable. Matthew grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. By the time he was 6, he could ride a horse competently and help move cattle. Margaret was more spirited, always getting into mischief, but she had a kind heart and a fierce loyalty to her family. In 1885, when Matthew was 6 and Margaret 3, Marlowe gave birth to twins, another boy and girl. They named them Nathan and Emily. The house was suddenly very full and very loud, but Xavier and Marlowe would not have had it any other way. The years passed, marked by birthdays and holidays, by seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle, by laughter and occasionally tears, but always by love. The children grew, and Xavier and Marlowe grew older too, though they both maintained the strength and vigor needed for ranch life. Matthew showed an interest in expanding the ranch operations, talking about breeding horses in addition to cattle. Margaret surprised everyone by developing a talent for painting, creating beautiful watercolors of the Texas landscape that people in town started asking to buy. Nathan and Emily were still young, but Nathan showed his father's quiet determination while Emily had her mother's quick mind and love of learning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Marlowe stood on their porch watching the sunset, just as they had done so many times before. The children were inside, Matthew reading to the younger ones, Margaret probably drawing. The house was full of noise and life, everything they had dreamed of and more. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked, his arm around Marlowe's waist. "Marrying a simple rancher, giving up the comforts of town life." Marlowe looked up at him, her eyes still as green and clear as the day he had pulled her from that mesquite thicket. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, Xavier. A home, a family, purpose, and most importantly, love. True, deep, lasting love. "You pulled me from a different kind of pain," Xavier said quietly. "The pain of loneliness, of feeling like I did not quite belong anywhere. You made me whole, Marlowe." "We made each other whole," Marlowe corrected, reaching up to cup his face. "That is what love does. It completes us, makes us better than we could ever be alone." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Inside the house, they could hear the children laughing, the sound of home and family and everything good in the world. As the years continued to pass, the Zimmerman Ranch became one of the most respected operations in the area. Xavier's reputation for honesty and fair dealing, combined with Marlowe's business acumen, made them successful beyond what Xavier had ever imagined when he first staked his claim on this land. Matthew eventually took over much of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, proving himself a capable and innovative rancher. He did start that horse breeding program, and the Zimmerman horses became sought after throughout Texas. At 21, he married a girl from town named Sarah, and they built a house on the far edge of the Zimmerman property, starting their own family while still being part of the ranch. Margaret pursued her art, eventually opening a small studio in El Paso where she taught painting and sold her work. She married a lawyer from back east who had moved to Texas seeking opportunity, and they had 3 children who spent their summers at the ranch, running wild just as their mother had done. Nathan became a doctor, inspired by old Dr. Harris who had delivered him. After completing his training in the East, he returned to El Paso and took over Dr. Harris's practice when the old doctor finally retired. He married a school teacher, and they lived in town but visited the ranch often. Emily, the youngest, inherited her mother's love of learning. She became a teacher herself, fighting against the limitations placed on women's education, and eventually helping to establish a proper school in El Paso that educated both boys and girls to a high standard. Xavier and Marlowe watched their children grow and thrive with pride and joy. They became grandparents many times over, their house always full of visiting children and grandchildren. Even as their hair turned gray and their movements slowed, they never lost the spark that had brought them together, that connection forged in pain and strengthened through years of shared life. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were dozens of people, children and grandchildren, in-laws and friends. Tables were set up outside, laden with food. Music played and people danced. It was chaos and it was beautiful, and Xavier and Marlowe stood in the midst of it, holding hands, marveling at what they had built together. "Thank you," Xavier said to Marlowe that evening after most of the guests had gone and they were alone on their porch once again. "For what?" Marlowe asked. "For saying yes, for taking a chance on a simple cowboy, for building this life with me, for pulling me from my pain just as surely as I pulled you from that thorny bush all those years ago." Marlowe squeezed his hand. "We saved each other," she said simply. "That is what love does. It rescues us, heals us, makes us whole. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "As would I," Xavier agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one, just as they had done countless times over the past 30 years. The house behind them was quiet now, but it was a good quiet, the quiet of a home filled with love and memories and the promise of many more years to come. Xavier was 72 years old when he finally retired from active ranch work, handing over full control to Matthew and his grandson, Matthew's son James, who showed every sign of being as capable a rancher as his father and grandfather before him. Xavier's body, worn by decades of hard work, could no longer keep the pace, but his mind remained sharp. He spent his days doing small jobs around the house, whittling toys for his great-grandchildren and sitting on the porch with Marlowe, talking and remembering. Marlowe, at 67, had also slowed down, though she still kept the household accounts and provided advice to Matthew on ranch matters. On a warm spring day in 1908, 30 years after Xavier had first pulled Marlowe from that mesquite thicket, they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset. 4 generations of Zimmermans were represented on the ranch now, with Matthew's grandson having just welcomed a son of his own. "We have been blessed," Marlowe said softly, her hand in Xavier's. "So very blessed." "We have," Xavier agreed. "More than I ever dreamed possible." "You remember that first day?" Marlowe asked. "When you found me in the thorns?" "Every detail," Xavier said. "The heat, the blood, the look in your eyes. I think I fell in love with you that very moment, though I did not realize it at the time." "You pulled me from the pain," Marlowe said, echoing the words she had spoken that day so long ago. "In every way possible. You gave me a reason to live again, Xavier. You gave me everything." "And you gave me a home," Xavier replied. "Not just this house, but a true home. A place where I belonged, where I was loved, where I mattered. You and the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. This family we built together. That is my home." As the sun set on another day, Xavier and Marlowe remained on their porch, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. The road from that thorny bush to this moment had been long and sometimes difficult, but they had traveled it together, and that had made all the difference. Years continued to add up like accumulated blessings. Xavier and Marlowe celebrated their 40th, then their 45th wedding anniversary, each milestone a testament to the strength of the love that had begun with a rescue from a thorny bush. Their bodies grew more frail, but their spirits remained strong and their love for each other never wavered. Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, Marlowe holding his hand. His last words were to tell her he loved her and that he would wait for her on the other side. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of West Texas, people whose lives had been touched by Xavier's kindness, honesty, and integrity. Marlowe lived for 3 more years, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She spoke often of Xavier, keeping his memory alive with stories of their life together. She remained at the ranch, in the house Xavier had built for her, unwilling to leave the place that held so many precious memories. When Marlowe passed away at the age of 77, she was laid to rest beside Xavier in the small cemetery on the edge of El Paso. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates, but also an inscription chosen by their children. Together they built a love that conquered all pain. The Zimmerman Ranch continued to prosper, passed down through the generations. Each new generation heard the story of how it all began, with a cowboy who rescued a woman from a thorny bush, and how that woman had told him, "You pulled me from the pain." They learned how that simple act of compassion had grown into a love story that spanned decades, that created a family, that built a legacy. The mesquite thicket, where Xavier had found Marlowe that fateful day, remained, a landmark on what was now Zimmerman land. Someone, probably Matthew, had placed a small stone marker there with a brass plaque that read, "Here began a great love story. May we all be so blessed." Visitors to the ranch, particularly young couples in love, would often ride out to see the spot, to stand where Xavier and Marlowe's story began. Some said you could feel the love there, lingering in the air like morning dew, a reminder that true love, the kind that pulls you from pain and makes you whole, was not just a fairy tale but a real possibility for anyone lucky enough to find it. The Zimmerman descendants continued to tell the story at family gatherings, ensuring that Xavier and Marlowe's love would never be forgotten. Great-great-grandchildren who never knew them personally grew up hearing about the cowboy who rescued the woman from the thorns, and how that moment of compassion changed the course of many lives. In El Paso, now a thriving city, there was a small park dedicated to the early settlers. Among the plaques and monuments was one for Xavier and Marlowe Zimmerman, recognizing their contributions to the community and celebrating their love story. School children would read the inscription and learn that love was not just about grand gestures but about daily choices, about choosing each other again and again, about building something lasting together. The blue dress Marlowe had worn on their first date, carefully preserved in a trunk, was eventually donated to the El Paso Historical Society. It was displayed alongside one of Xavier's worn work gloves and one of Margaret's paintings of the ranch, representing the family that had become such an integral part of Texas history. On quiet evenings when the wind blew across the Texas plains, some swore they could still hear echoes of laughter from the old Zimmerman house, the sound of children playing, of a family living and loving and building a life together. Whether it was imagination or something more, it reminded people that love, true love, never really dies. It lives on in the lives touched, in the families created, in the stories passed down through generations. Matthew, in his old age, would sit on the porch of the house his father had built and look out over the land his family had worked for generations. He would think about his parents, about the love they had shared, and he would smile. That love had created all of this, the ranch, the family, the legacy. It had started with a rescue from a thorny bush and had grown into something that would last forever. The thorny bush itself eventually died, as all plants do, but the story lived on. That was the true magic of Xavier and Marlowe's love. It transcended time and place, becoming something larger than just two people. It became a reminder to everyone who heard it that love was worth fighting for, worth working for, worth building a life around. In the records of El Paso, in the stories passed down through generations of Zimmermans, in the memories of a community, Xavier and Marlowe's love story remained vibrant and alive. The cowboy who had pulled a woman from a thorny bush, and the woman who had told him he pulled her from the pain, had created something that would never die, a love that would echo through time, inspiring others to seek out that same deep connection, that same partnership, that same kind of love that makes life worth living. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest legacy anyone could leave, not wealth or fame, but proof that love, real love, was possible. That two people could find each other, could build a life together, could create a family and a home and a love that would outlast them both. Xavier and Marlowe Zimmerman had done exactly that, and their story would be told for as long as there were people who believed in the power of love to transform lives, to heal pain, and to create something beautiful that would last forever.